This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 254. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary article plug, Alan, is Disaster Recovery with ZFS, a practical guide.
Yeah. So this week we're walking through how to use ZFS to build your disaster recovery system and what some of the advantages to that are. Having the end-to-end checksumming, the atomic snapshots, being able to do really efficient replication, the self-healing, the encryption, the compression, all that, and how to set up site-to-site replication and make really good disaster recovery and be able to do the testing and application-specific recovery that you need in order to get the most out of your system.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Vulnerability Advisory, Sudo chroot elevation of privilege.
Yeah, so this one's pretty bad, where an attacker can leverage sudo's --chroot option to run arbitrary commands as root, even if that user is not listed in the sudo file at all.
And if you're wondering, wait a minute, sudo chroot option? What's that? Well, perhaps you're a graybeard like us, because this is a relatively new option, at least in terms of sudo's history. The chroot option wasn't introduced until mid to late 2020. And this honestly was the first I'd even heard of it. I had never noticed it when that feature popped up. So the first I learned of it was when this new feature that I never asked for and never needed suddenly made all of my systems vulnerable to literally anybody being able to use it to become root, whether they were in the sudoers file or not.
Yeah, so it turns out back in sudo 1.9.14, which wasn't that long ago, they made some changes to how they resolve the paths in this chroot configuration, and in doing so, accidentally introduced this vulnerability, where basically they changed when they do some of the checking and how they apply the chroot, and it means that they applied the chroot and then did the NS switch lookups, which is the mechanism in FreeBSD and Linux that allows you to extend how you look up a username. So instead of just having your local password file, you can have things like LDAP or NIS or whatever. And because they applied the chroot first, you could make it read an nsswitch.conf file from the chroot, and then have it also load the LDAP libraries or whatever from within that chroot. And so you could make up a directory with your own shared libraries that do whatever you want, and an NS switch that says load them, and then run sudo with this chroot thing. And when it goes to look up your username, it runs your code as root before it even gets around to checking the sudoers file. And now, boom, you have a root shell.
And moving things back to my whole complaint of who the hell needed chroot built into sudo anyway? If you want to do a chroot and do sudo inside it, or the other way around, or whatever. This really doesn't need to just all be glommed onto one thing. Well, apparently the project has come to the same conclusion, because in their own announcement of this bug, they mention the change from sudo 1.9.14, which made this feature vulnerable, has been reverted in 1.9.17p1, and the chroot feature has been marked as deprecated. It will be removed entirely in a future sudo release. Because of the way sudo resolves commands, supporting a user-specified chroot directory is error-prone, and this feature does not appear to be widely used, which brings me back to my original outrage. Why did you put that in there to begin with? Chroots, they've always given the appearance of being a security feature while not actually introducing security and being more likely to poke holes in things. So it's really kind of rustling my jimmies to learn that, the project just kind of decided to throw that in there. I'm just like, why? This is very much load-bearing software we're talking about here. This is not some trivial application that a few people run for jollies. This is a core part of every Linux distribution, as far as I'm aware, every Linux distribution's security strategy. So just arbitrarily deciding to stick a new feature on there that incorporates something that looks like a security feature but has a long history of actually being a source of security holes, my head's spinning here.
Yeah, the chroot feature, when it was added, was not intended to be a security feature. It was a release engineering feature. It was added in BSD to be able to compile a new version of BSD on the old version in a contained environment so that you could make sure your new build wasn't touching anything from the old version and mixing things together. And it kind of grew over time and became what some people consider a security feature, and especially things like web hosts that want to lock, oh, you can run this command, but we're going to lock you down. But because of the security critical nature of this, the chroot command by default does not let you do it if you're not already root. So you can't have somebody else like chroot into something and then use sudo. And so it was really ill-advised to add it to sudo, and really shows that, every set UID binary on your system is a very big risk. And getting that number down seems like a really worthwhile effort. And so in FreeBSD, they're actually looking at a way of using the mandatory access control framework to not need something like sudo anymore. So there was an interesting talk about this at BSDCan a couple of weeks ago with the macdo and mdo command that are actually looking at a way to do this without ever needing set UID binaries at all. So that if there is a security flaw in the binary, like in this case of sudo, it doesn't mean somebody can escalate to root privileges unnecessarily.
This actually has me kind of wanting to look into an application I was aware of, but never saw any need to pursue before. There's a sudo alternative called doas. And until today, I never really saw the point in even looking at it. Like I would see some people talking about using doas instead of sudo and, just kind of scratch my head like, why? Whereas now I'm scratching my head and saying, why at the sudo project? And wondering, maybe I should be looking at doas. This is not an endorsement, folks. I'm literally telling you, I've never actually looked at it. I'm just aware of its existence. But this bug does make me wonder if I should be looking a little bit closer. Because again, the thing that really gripes me so much about this, and this should probably serve as like a warning, like watch out for creeping featureism. This comes down to like somebody had a brilliant idea one day and they got their pet idea incorporated into a project. And this happens to any number of projects. You see feature creep, you see things come in out of scope. Somebody says, oh, wouldn't this be neat and shiny if we did this? But the thought process isn't really there. And you don't see this as frequently on things that are really low-level core infrastructure, like the sudo command. But it happens all the time in all kind of software projects, and this particular bug is a reminder that, yes, it can even happen in things like sudo, where, if the maintainers aren't vigilant enough and they're not keeping a firm enough grasp on what the scope of the project actually is, and thinking through long-term consequences, especially on any security-related project, you will wind up with things like this introduced, and, they will poke holes into your project that you could drive a truck through.
I was somewhat skeptical about Ubuntu investigating and experimenting with sudo rs, which is the Rust reimplementation of sudo. And now I'm less skeptical of that, let's say.
In the defense here, this was not a memory safety bug. Sudo rs would have had the same bug.
Well, except that it doesn't have all the features of sudo.
Right. And that's kind of to Jim's point about doas, like maybe like if we looked at the number of lines of code in sudo and, is it doing a lot more than it maybe needs to, and something more simple. So doas is from OpenBSD, and so, has the right levels of paranoia about a bunch of things. Although, as they pointed out, it was designed for OpenBSD, and porting it to Linux means you have to have equivalence to some of the features that OpenBSD has. And if the port isn't done properly, then doas might not be as safe on Linux as it is on OpenBSD. But I think that's just them saying, you can't just go and plop this over and expect it to work. It has to actually be hooked up properly. And I don't know the status of that. But doas is interesting in that it's a much, much smaller code base to do the thing you're trying to do. And since most people's use of sudo is not as complicated as sudo is, it might be a better choice.
Well, if we consult the venerable Arch Wiki for information on this, it opens up saying, OpenDoas is a portable version of OpenBSD's doas command known for being substantially smaller in size compared to sudo. Like sudo, doas is used to assume the identity of another user on the system, and then from there it's just straight into installation. The fact that the Arch Wiki has an entry on doas and it's that brief before it just goes straight into here's how you install it and use it kind of makes me feel like it's probably in pretty good shape.
But I feel like a modern reimplementation in a modern language that's memory safe feels like a better long-term option to me.
It's hard to say, honestly. I agree with you about the value of, modern implementations in memory safe languages. I think we're all thoroughly sick of the classes of bug that C and C++ almost seem to dictate, in the way that they handle memory. But to Alan's point earlier, memory safety was not the specific issue here. A clean reimplementation certainly isn't the worst idea. Of course, those can introduce bugs in the same way that they can close them. So there's no guarantees there. But I do think that DoAs is worth another look for a lot of folks. I say, again, I have to stress, I am not a seasoned user of DoAs. I'm not a user of DoAs at all. But I have learned to trust the ArchWiki pretty freaking thoroughly. And, once the ArchWiki gets through how to install DoAs, the next section is how to ensure a smooth transition from Sudo into DoAs. And I have to believe that the ArchWiki is just that glib about like, oh yeah, here's just do this and you'll be fine. Their smooth transition largely is just about aliasing sudo to DoAs, the actual command. So if you type sudo, you'll run DoAs instead, which kind of leaves me feeling like, that'll probably be okay, especially for my own use of sudo, which, like I said, I never even knew there was a chroot option because why would I? I don't need that. I use sudo for its original intended purpose, to either elevate and become root or to, assume the identity of another user, and in particular, just for the space of one command. I would normally use, su. I learned, that's kind of uncommon for Linux users, but I learned that from my FreeBSD days because I started out over there in the FreeBSD camp with Alan. And in FreeBSD land, you don't use sudo at all. You typically use su to become root, and your whole shell becomes a root shell. Matter of fact, most of the time when I use sudo, I'm actually just doing sudo-s to, once again, turn the whole shell into a root shell. But the idea of being able to just uproot it and replace it, I think that's a great thing regardless, and we should have more of that. I think it's awesome that we could just elect to say, you know what? No, I'm done with you, sudo. I'm going to replace you with DoAs, and that's actually doable. I wish we could do that with lots more of the foundational pieces of our operating system stacks that should be that easy to drop in an equivalent replacement for.
Well, in particular, the avoiding monocultures and making sure there are two options for every piece of the stack.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sudo and DoAs, or there's, FreeBSD and Linux, or OpenSSL and an alternative to OpenSSL. That's not just a fork of a different version of it. I think that avoiding those monocultures is really important to making sure that there is some of this. But I think to Joe's point, Rust reimplementations are great, but I think especially when looking at something like sudo, you have to be maybe a little more harsh about deciding which features you're going to reimplement and which ones you're going to not. And that cuts into the drop-in replacement, right? If you drop a bunch of features, then it's less of a drop-in replacement. And how do you strike the right balance between, we have this nice, clean implementation that's better, and it doesn't do everything the old one did, but maybe it's because the old one shouldn't have done those in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's good to not do everything the old one did.
And now we're back to the old days of Linux Luddites, ladies and gentlemen. And valued non-binary others.
Come on, I'm talking about rewriting stuff in Rust. That's not exactly Luddite, is it?
It's not.
Well, no, but certainly the talk about we shouldn't have all these bloody features and we just strip them right back out and go back to things being simple, that's about as Luddite as it gets.
Yeah, let's do the proper Unix philosophy. Why is chroot in sudo? It should be two separate things.
Preaching to the crowd here, I'm a huge fan of the Unix philosophy myself. About the only time I ever came down against the folks arguing for the Unix philosophy was specifically with ZFS, when ZFS first became a big deal in Linux, and people were complaining about it violating the Unix philosophy by, compressing the storage stack. Instead of having a separate RAID manager and volume manager and file system, it's all in this one thing. And I got the argument. I understood the argument. I'm not mad at the argument. The only reason I came down on OpenZFS's side in that one is because you had to collapse that stack in order to get some mission critical features that really, really did matter. They weren't just frippery and bullshit tacked on for, no good reason.
Well, isn't that somewhat the argument for systemd as well?
Do we really need to get into that kind of a flame war? That is a difficult one, honestly. And yeah, there are things that systemd does that it couldn't do without some stack collapsing. With that said, it's not like systemd exactly tries to minimize the amount of that it does. Systemd wants to be the all shining, all singing, all dancing crap of the world, and I don't enjoy that at all.
The definition of a slippery slope.
Yeah. Systemd is somewhere past a slippery slope and more towards, oh yeah, we just chucked it off the cliff and watched it fall.
Yeah.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. VMware Perpetual License Holder receives audit letter from Broadcom. This is an escalation.
Yes. So after last time where we saw the cease and desist letter saying, hey, if you have a perpetual license, which we've now canceled, you can use the software, but only that version of the software, not any new updates to it. So if you've installed any updates, go on and install those updates. And now they're actually getting to the point where they are actually triggering audits of some of their customers. We're going to come in now and see that you're using only the number of licenses you're paying for and that you don't have any of the updates installed. And I think the bigger part of this is more the demands on the companies being audited, right? It's not just that, an auditor is going to check some stuff. It's like, no, you're expected to make time for them, within 2 or 3 days usually, and shoulder the burden of all these extra costs for us to verify that the license we pulled out from under you is not getting more than we feel it should.
If you've never gone through one of these kinds of audits before, I've certainly never gone through one from VMware. But I have seen the results of Business Software Alliance audits when, typically it's Microsoft. The Business Software Alliance was like a big three, Microsoft, Adobe, and I forget who the other major leg of the triangle was. But generally, if you got a BSA audit, it was usually going to be Microsoft driving in my experience. And those things were invasive and expensive and harassment like you would not believe. And I mean, I saw companies get driven out of business by that kind of thing. And not being a VMware customer myself, I haven't read through their entire, terms of service, but I would imagine that there's something buried in, a mile of legalese when you first buy the software that says you're agreeing to that. You're agreeing to be audited should, the owner of VMware deem it necessary. In which case, yeah, you either submit to the audit or they say you don't have any valid licenses and they've got enough reason to believe that, you're – and you can't see this, dear listeners, but I'm doing the scare quotes here as hard as I can. You're pirating their software and, then you wind up having to defend a software piracy suit that's going to be even more expensive and even more of a hassle than the audit was. This does perhaps raise the question – why are you dealing with these kinds of jackasses in the first place? Why are you not reading these terms and conditions? Or if you are reading them, why are you agreeing to them? There are other options out there.
So the letter says that a company called Connor Consulting is going to show up and start doing this. They will want to review your company's VMware deployment and entitlements, which may include fieldwork or remote testing, and meetings with members of your accounting, licensing, and management information systems functions. And informs recipients that someone from Connor will reach out shortly and that VMware users should respond within 3 business days.
This also means that you're letting people touch the most sensitive and mission-critical parts of your business. Rando jackasses you've never met before, you don't even have a formal business relationship with. It's a third-party auditing company, and you have to walk them into your server room. And I really cannot adequately express my distaste for this kind of expectation.
Yeah, and in particular, as the article points out, these are companies that chose not to have the new support subscription because it's too much money. So they're already, have a tight budget. And it's like, oh, well, we need a bunch of your people to drop everything and do all these meetings and comply with all this auditing. And, that's not free. That's time from this giant list of employees as they go through and disruptively check all these things.
It really does raise the question, at what point is it legitimately cheaper to say, you know what, we are no longer using any VMware products. We're migrating every single freaking thing elsewhere. I mean, KVM is right there. I do understand that there is more to VMware than just the hypervisor. I really do. I understand that there are very real costs involved in, training people to something that has not been the industry standard up till that point. That was really the biggest argument for VMware for most of its existence, is just like it's the thing that you can most reliably expect to find people already knowing how to use because they've used it in other jobs. That's how things wind up being de facto industry monopolies in the first place. Everybody just goes, oh, well, we can hire people that know how to use that, so that's all they do, and they use that. Everybody else uses that. Everybody hires the people who know that, and it becomes the thing that everybody uses. Then somebody like Broadcom comes along and acquires something, and all of a sudden you've really got the screws put to you. It feels like, to me, there are a lot of stakeholders that should be getting involved in these kinds of decisions at an earlier phase and foreseeing this kind of problem and, looking at alternatives and saying, hey, we should maybe be minimizing. I don't know if we even really have a good industry term for this yet. I mean, it's essentially like an attack surface. The more of these deals that you sign on to with proprietary entities that have these really obnoxious terms of service and, yada, 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 and can be acquired at any time, and you don't have much in the way of real rights to the software. You've just basically got a usage license with a lot of conditions tacked onto it. You have to consider that as something along the lines of like attack surface. Like if you accumulate too much of that, it's going to bite you. You're going to get hit. And maybe these stakeholders should be thinking about that ahead of time and continually working to minimize that type of attack surface in the organization.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. George writes, in the small business I work for, one of the many hats I wear is IT. I've been tightening up our network security, but one tripping point for me is what ports to allow for outbound traffic from the network. I don't want to kill all traffic from the onset by denying everything. I know that I'll have to work with the other people on the network to ensure that all of our tools work correctly, but I am certain I will forget a number of commonly used outbound traffic ports, and I can avoid consternation by having a useful starting point.
So this is a chewy one. There is no one-size-fits-all answer for this because we don't know what tools you're using, and so we have no way to tell you what outbound ports you'll have to allow. The first thing, if you're not familiar with trying to implement this kind of firewall that you need to be aware of, is that there is a huge range of what are called dynamic ports that you have to be careful. If your firewall is capable of or worried about the origination port as opposed to the destination port outbound, you have to make sure that people are allowed to use their dynamic ports for the outbound range. Now, as far as the target ports that they're hitting on the outside, sure, there are some obvious ones. You've got to allow HTTP and HTTPS, which is TCP 80 and 443. But then it gets interesting, like, do you want to allow SMTP 25 for sending email? The answer, surprisingly, is usually no, because most of the time these days, you're not going to be doing unencrypted mail outbound on port 25. If you're sending mail in an actual mail protocol rather than just using your browser at all, it's going to be one of the encrypted variants. So you're probably going to be using 587 for, they call it submission, which is, the TLS after the session is started for SMTP, or you might instead need the port for SMTPS, which I forget off the top of my head. I think it's like 993 or something. Similarly, there are, IMAP and IMAP-S ports. There's a whole range of this, and that's just for email. We don't know if you're using any instant messaging that might use a specific port of its own. There's a huge amount of possible stuff that you might run afoul of. Now, the one advice that I can give you for this is when you begin implementing this kind of firewall, absolutely talk to people, get a list of all the tools that you need to support, look those up. You can go ahead and make sure that you get those in there to begin with. But one of the best things that you can do is when you first put the firewall in place, don't actually deny non-matching outbound packets, log them instead. If you do that, then what you can do is you can look at a couple of days worth of traffic and you can analyze, okay, what external port numbers are my people hitting? Where are those hits coming from in the organization? And are these valid or invalid? And you can go through those and narrow them down. Now, if you've done that for a day, you've got a good idea. If you've done it for a week, you have an even better idea. By the time you've hit a month or so, you have probably identified every valid port you might actually need to use. And now you can think about starting to actually block outbound stuff that doesn't match a rule that allows things through.
To some degree, though, I wonder if that's even the right approach. All these firewalls nowadays are going to be stateful. So, you're blocking people from getting in, except for the specific things you allow. How much do you care about what port people are connecting out on? If they're connecting out to something on an odd port, that's not necessarily bad. Like, are you blocking that for a reason? Or should you just allow anything outbound but inbound be restrictive on what can come back in?
I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one, Alan.
Well, I'm not disagreeing. I'm not saying that you should just allow everything outbound. I'm saying at some point, are you buying more trouble by trying to pick and choose the ports that are allowed outbound?
Well, what you're doing is you're making sure that a whole bunch of right out of the box script kiddie tools won't work. That's really the point in that. If you've got a small environment with 20 or 30 relatively trustworthy users, no, this is not going to be worth the trouble. But if you're administering a network with, 200, 1,000, 10,000 users, all with their own machines and all with their own problems and all with their own individual tendency to click the shiny link, it starts becoming a lot more interesting to, block off a wide swath of your potential problems. Narrowing your issues down from I'm vulnerable to every possible script kiddie to, well, I only really have to worry about APTs because, I've already made life difficult enough. The script kiddies aren't going to get anywhere anytime quick. That's worthwhile. Also, slowing down the attackers is worthwhile. Giving them something to trip over that will cause you visibility is worthwhile when you're talking about administering a large network. And also, the trump card here is we actually edited George's question down a little bit, and he was talking about trying to bring his organization into compliance with some specific U.S. government NIST rules and certificates. And in order to do that, he does have to do outbound filtering.
Okay. It's just, you're talking about script kiddies here. It's like, well, if they're not already inside the network, then blocking outbound doesn't matter. And if they're already inside the network, then you've already lost, right? Like, what is this script kiddie going to use on port 4914?
Well, Alan, an awful lot of script kiddie tools try to use IRC for their command and control. And if IRC is blocked outbound, then they can't actually reach their tool because, yes, their tool got dropped inside the network, but it's failing at reaching out to them. The same thing with tools that use FTP, which there are a good bit of script kiddie things that do that. And typically, if the tool that's been dropped in your network is relying on HTTP or HTTPS to do exfil or CNC, if you're talking about this kind of network where you're looking at implementing this kind of filtering, you've probably already got some pretty seriously draconian stuff that's based at what websites you're allowed to talk to or not talk to, and what swaths of the internet you are or aren't. So again, you're limiting the scope of the nastiness that could be getting out of your network. You're narrowing it down into lanes where it's easier to manage.
Yeah, it's just I don't know how many script kiddie control networks aren't running on port 443 nowadays, even if they still use IRC. In
my experience, quite a few. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff that tries to exfil stuff on weird ports if it's allowed to. There's a lot of stuff that uses odd protocols for its CNC. This is worth doing in a large network.
Like, I've definitely seen network monitors looking for and blocking anything that is IRC because the more predominant use of it now is CNC networks, not actually people connecting to IRC.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.